saw Napoleon at breakfast in his bath. Expected to have found him discontented on account of the occurrences of the morning, but he was in a very good humor. He was eating some lentils, of which he asked the English name, and if I had ever seen any before. I replied that I had seen some in Egypt, but none in England. "That arch-laveler PA," said he, laughing, "asserts that you have none in England, and in fact that you have no good vegetables, legumes." I replied that it was equally true with the rest of PA's falsehoods, that in no country in Europe were there better vegetables or a more plentiful supply. Napoleon laughed at the warmth with which I expressed myself and said, "Oh, that atrocious libeler PA. You English do not like to hear anything bad of your own country, though you are so fond of abusing other nations. I fancy that if PA had gone to England after the publication of that book, he would have had his brains beaten out by you." I said that he would certainly have been treated with the contempt which he deserved. Napoleon then remarked that the northern people required the bottle to develop their ideas, that the English appeared in general to prefer the bottle to the ladies, as was exemplified by our allowing them to go away from table and remaining for hours to drink and intoxicate ourselves. I replied that although we did sit sometimes for hours after the ladies withdrew, it was more for the sake of conversation than for wine, of which the lasser was not so much drunk as formerly, that moreover it was optional to retire immediately after the ladies were to remain. He appeared to doubt this and made me repeat it, after which he said that were he in England, he would always leave with the ladies. "It appears to me," said he, "that you do not pay regard enough to the ladies. If your object is to converse instead of to drink, why not allow them to be present? Surely conversation is never so lively or so witty as when ladies take part in it. If I were an Englishwoman, I should feel very discontented at being turned out by the men to wait for 2 or 3 hours while they were guzzling their wine. Now in France, society is nothing unless ladies are present. They are the life of conversation." I endeavored to make it appear that our conversation after dinner frequently turned upon politics and other matters with which the ladies seldom meddled. Moreover, that in well-regulated societies, the gentlemen soon followed them. This did not, however, satisfy him. He maintained that it was a custom which could not be justified, that women were necessary to civilize and to soften the other sex. He spoke about Maréchal Jourdan, of whose military talents he had a poor opinion. I observed that I had been told by some English officers who had been present at the Battle of Reibereien that if Marshal Soult had advanced after the attack made by the Lancers, he would have cut the English army to pieces. Napoleon acquiesced in this and said that he had censured Soult for having neglected to do so. He then adverted to the English mode of besieging towns and said that Lord Wellington at sieges was le bourreau des hommes, the executioner of men, that the immense sacrifice of men at Ciudad Rodrigo and Badajoz was by no means compensated by the capture of those places. He observed that the storming of Bergen op Zoom was a most daring attempt, but that it ought not or could not have succeeded, the number of the garrison being greater than that of the assailants. I observed that the failure was in part to be attributed to one of the generals not having taken the precaution to communicate the orders which had been given to him to anyone else, so that when he was killed or mortally wounded, the troops did not know how to act. Napoleon replied that even if no accident of the kind had occurred, the attempt ought not to have succeeded unless the party attacked became, as sometimes happened, panic-struck. Graham, he observed, had been commissary with the army at the time of his first career of arms at Toulon. "A daring old man," said he, and asked if he were not the same who had commanded in the affair near Cadiz. Fifth, had some conversation in the morning with Napoleon relative to the deficiency of fuel at Longwood and with General Montcalm on the same subject. Went to Plantation House by order of Sir Hudson Lowe, to whom I communicated the particulars of the deficiency of fuel and the observations I had been desired to make upon the subject. Had a long discussion with His Excellency and explained that there were 23 fires in all at Longwood, which he thought much too numerous. He answered in his accustomed manner that they had no business with so many. I explained to him that Longwood was very damp and that the French ladies and children required constant fires. He said that Lady Lowe had no fire in her room. I observed that the French were natives of a more southern climate than ours and consequently more susceptible of cold than ours, and consequently more susceptible, and the comparison made between the comfort of such a building as Plantation House and Longwood. His Excellency said that he did not see any necessity for so many fires, and that he had seen a fire burning in the Countess Bertrand's room in the middle of summer. I told him I had no observation to make upon that circumstance. I observed that it was necessary to regulate the quantity of wood by the season, as what was too much in summer was too little in winter, and explained to him that I had done everything in my power to explain to the French that he thought the allowance which he had ordered for Longwood was sufficient, as he had made it nearly double of what was consumed at Plantation House. I also told His Excellency that Napoleon could not bear the smell of coals, and suggested that instead of sending wood to the soldiers in camp, coals might be furnished and the wood sent to Longwood, to which he replied that he did not like to humor any person's whims. Saw Napoleon in his bath after some conversation respecting the deficiency of fuel. He said that he had seen Admiral Plampin, who had brought him a book which he, the Admiral, said had been sent out by Lord Bathurst, which, added Napoleon, I suppose his lordship has sent in order to discover the author, as in the letter which the Admiral said he saw. It was attributed to Benjamin Constant or Madame de Staël. Napoleon then observed that he had spoken to the Admiral about ships of war and their interior economy. The Admiral says that a 74-gun ship will take about 80 tons more water by means of the tanks. Had I known this in 1806 or 1808, I would have sent an army of 30,000 men to invade India. I had made several calculations about the possibility of sending so large a body of men to India, but always found that they would have been short of water for a month. I asked what his plan was. In Brest, said Napoleon, I had at one time as many as 56 sail of the line and often 46. In 40 of these line of battleships, I intended to have dispersed 30,000 soldiers, 800 in each, and only 400 sailors. There were to have been a proportionate number of frigates and other smaller vessels. 10 of the line of battleships would have been old and of little value. They were also to take on board 600 or 800 dismounted cavalry and a portion of artillery, with everything necessary for an army to take the field and be provisioned for 4 months. They were to make the best of their way to the Isle of France, where they would have watered and provisioned afresh, landed their sick, and taken on board some other troops to replace them with 3,000 blacks to form colonial regiments. From thence they were to have proceeded to India and to have disembarked in the nearest possible place, so as to have allowed the Maharajas, with whom I had an understanding, to join them. They were to form the cavalry of the army. A few of the French were also to be mounted, and all the horses they could procure purchased. After landing, they were to have burnt the 10 old ships and divide their crews among the rest, who would have been thus fully manned. They would then proceed in different directions and do you all possible mischief in your settlements. I had, continued he, an understanding with the Maharajas and others in India by the way of Basura, Baghdad, Mocha, Surah. Their communications were made to the councils at Aleppo through the ambassador in Persia. I had frequently earlier intelligence from India than you had in England. The king of Persia favorably was disposed towards us. All this plan, however, was frustrated by the calculations I had made, which allowed me and showed me that the ships must fall short of water by a month. Had I known of those tanks, I certainly would have made the attempt. Napoleon then calculated the number of tons which would have been gained by the tanks and found that the ships would have had more than sufficient water. For a power which is inferior by sea, said he, it is an invention of great importance, as it will prevent the necessity of their going into harbor to water. I mentioned to St. Louverture and observed that among other calumnies, some of his enemies had asserted that he had caused him to be put to death privately in prison. It does not deserve an answer, replied Napoleon. What possible interest could I have in putting a Negro to death after he had arrived in France? Had he died in St. Domingo, then indeed something might have been suspected, but after he had safely arrived in France, what object could have been in view? One of the greatest follies I was ever guilty of, continued the emperor, was sending that army out to St. Domingo. I ought to have prevented the possibility of its being effected. I committed a great oversight and fault in not having declared St. Domingo free, acknowledged the black government, and before the Peace of Amiens sent some French officers to assist them. Had I done this, it would have been more consonant to the principles under which I was acting. It would have done you incalculable mischief. You would have lost Jamaica, and your other colonies would have followed. Having once acknowledged them, I could not have sent an army out there during the peace. But after the peace, I was continually beset with application from proprietors of estates in the colony, merchants, and others. Indeed, the nation had la rage to regain St. Domingo, and I was obliged to comply with it. But had I, previous to the peace, acknowledged the blacks, I could, under that plea, have refused to make any attempts to retake it, in doing which I acted contrary to my own judgments. The Sext informed Count Montsalon, by direction of Sir Hudson Lowe, that the latter had regulated the quantity of fuel necessary for Longwood by comparison with that consumed at Plantation House, and thought that by giving twice as much coal as was used there, and 300 weight of wood daily, he had allowed a sufficiency. That, however, if any application had been made, he would have increased the quantity. I also showed him a letter from Major Gorker stating the quantity used in Plantation House. Count Montsalon replied that they were not bound to regulate the quantity of fuel they thought necessary to burn at Longwood by that consumed by Sir Hudson Lowe at Plantation House, where there were only 4 or 5 fireplaces, and there were 23 at Longwood. That, moreover, they were natives of a warmer and a drier climate than the English, and stood in need of more heat. That the dampness of Longwood rendered fires absolutely necessary for the preservation of their health. That both his own and the Countess's clothes were spoiled by the damp, in spite of the fires which were used. As to asking for more, he did not like to subject himself to slightings or refusals. Napoleon for some days has eaten no dinner. Told me that he intended to accustom himself to only 1 meal a day. Mentioned in the course of conversation that he once had it in contemplation to have sent 5,000 men to invade Suriname, and asked me, as I had been there, if I thought it would have succeeded. I replied that I thought not. First, on account of the difficulty of approaching the coast, as large ships could not come nearer than 17 or 18 miles, and the channel for vessels not drawing more than 18 feet water was only practicable at high water. It's very difficult, intricate, and required the aid of a skillful pilot. Besides, that the country itself was full of marshes, very inaccessible, that there was a garrison of 3 regiments, besides the colonial militia. Fort Amsterdam was strong and could for some time sustain a regular siege. The weather has not been so bad as this is for some time past. Napoleon went out as far as Count Bertrand's. Veramente, he said yesterday when speaking of the weather. Non è paese cristiano. It's not a Christian country.